In this video, I'm going to go through my process for converting assets to Source 2, enabling their use in Source 2 Filmmaker. This includes converting models from Source 1 games as well as games that use other engines. Assets ported from Source 1 will be using third-party programs Crowbar and VTF-Edit, and assets ported from other games will be requiring Blender. All these tools are free tools and links are in the description. The first part is going to go over some background information about the asset pipeline and folder setup for Source 2, so go to the timestamp on screen now if you're already familiar with that. So let's talk about the Source 2 asset pipeline. Within the folder for your Source 2 game, in this case Half-Life Alyx, you'll see two folders, Content and Game. Like Source 1, all the game-ready assets that the engine is going to be reading from and running the game, or the various tools like Source Filmmaker or Hammer Editor, these are all going to be located within the Game folder. Unlike Source 1, however, 99% of the time, you don't need to make any changes to this folder at all. Just leave this folder alone. The Content folder is where all the fun happens, specifically the HLVR_addons folder. When you create an add-on from the Workshop Tools launcher, a corresponding folder is created here. This is where you will put all your raw asset files that the tools will be then using to create your materials and your models. These will be things like your image textures, your mesh files, all that sort of thing. The entire asset pipeline in Source 2 is incredibly streamlined, where once you set up a vModel and vMaterial file here in the Content folder, any changes made to the original mesh or image file will be automatically recompiled by the editor tools and show up right away in tools like Source Filmmaker and Hammer. vModel and vMaterial files are Source 2's equivalent to the QC model compiling scripts and the VMT material files from Source 1. Unlike Source 1, however, vModel and vMaterial files are created and configured within the Workshop tools themselves. You don't have to know the coding syntax for QC or VMT files. You don't need to spend time writing any of that out by hand. You just hit some buttons within the editor tools and those files are created automatically. It's super simple. One additional thing to keep in mind is that wherever you save your vModel and vMaterial files here within your add-ons folder is where they're going to be compiled to within the game folder. So if I save a model in my add-ons, models, Spartanburger, Homeworld, ships, and then somewhere in here, that corresponding file structure is going to be created within the game folder, and that's where the game-ready assets are going to be located. Now for actually porting models. This process is super simple as long as you have mesh files that the engine can read. Source 2 is compatible with FBX, SMD, and DMX files, so the first step is making sure that the model you want ported is in one of those formats. Now, Source 2 can technically open Source 1 model files, but that process is inconsistent, it's incredibly jank, it spits errors at you, and this tutorial will be 10 times longer to go through that process. So for this process, let's just whap the model file with Crowbar and get ourselves an SMD file that the engine can read. So let's open up Crowbar, and on the Decompile tab under Model Input, hit Browse and select the model that you want to decompile. In this case, I'm going to be using the Hyperspace Core model from Homeworld Remastered. It's a model that I compiled into Source 1 a couple years ago, but I never did anything with it and never published it. And then under Output 2, we select the folder that we want the model to be compiled to. I've set it to be somewhere within the Content folder. I like using the same file format system, folder setup system as Source 1, so that's what I've created here. Hit Open, then hit Decompile. And then if I look at the Explorer file here, I can see that within that file, my mesh has been created, and so has a QC and an animations folder. We don't need those at all, but nevertheless, here's our mesh file, and this is what the engine's going to be using to create our model. Now, for a model from another game, the hard part is going to be getting the meshes and material textures out of that game's files. This can be a complex process and can change depending on the game in question, so I won't be going over that in this video. For the same reason, I'm also not going to be going over the process for cleaning up the model in Blender to do things like adding proper armatures, fixing bones that may not have been applied properly, fixing models and meshes that have multiple UVs, or anything like that. It can still be helpful to know those things, and there are plenty of other tutorials out there that will cover this, so I highly recommend looking around and watching a couple of those. However, for this process, I'm going to assume that you have a model ready to go in Blender. So with your model open in Blender, just export it to the Content folder as an FBX and an SMD or a DMX file. FBX is within File, Export, FBX, and then for the SMD or the DMX, you need to have Blender Source Tools installed. For this example, I'm going to be porting the Bentusi Exchange ship model from Homeworld Remastered. It's another ship model that I exported and ported into Source 1, but for the purposes of this example, I'm going to be working from the Blender file rather than from the Source 1 file, just to show what that process is like. I like to export as a DMX file rather than an FBX. I'm old-fashioned. It ultimately I don't think it really matters too much. So under Blender Source Tools, I'm going to set up the export path to the folder within the content folder that I want. I have it set under Models, Spartanburger, Homeworld Ships, Bantusi. For the engine path, you need to select the location within the game directory where the resource compiler is located. For Source 1, that's Studio Model, but for Source 2, it's Resource Compiler. For Half-Life Alyx, that's within the game folder, under bin, Win64, it's in there. If you're exporting as a DMX, like me, you need to make sure you're using the most current version of DMX. That's Binary 9 and Model 22. And the reason for that is because older versions of DMX are not compatible with Source 2. Or the other way around. Source 2 is not compatible with older versions of DMX. It'll give you an error if you try and export it. Now that that's all set up, we're good to go. I'm going to hit export the scene. And if we go back to Windows Explorer, we will see that our mesh files have already showed up. And we're good to go with the next step in this process. From this point forward, whether it was a model from Source 1 or from another game, the process for getting the model into Source 2 should be the same. So with the workshop tools open, click on the model doc editor to open it up. Right away before we begin, let's have a look at the outliner here. You can see that there's an add button and a star button. Under the add button is a whole bunch of different parameters, most of which have little descriptions of what they do. These are the ways that you set up various complex things about a model, like different skin groups, different body groups. You want to give it a collision model, you want to give it some different physics, anything like that you set up in this window here with these kinds of options. In this case, all we're doing is a simple model port, so what we need is add meshes, which is here. However, rather than using this menu, we're going to do it the quick and simple way, which is to just hit this star button here, hit add meshes, and then we just need to select our mesh. In this case, I'm going to do the hyperspace core first. Hit open. You won't see anything right away, and that's because you first need to compile the model. Whenever the yellow outline and recompile needed warning appears, any changes you make will not be represented in the preview window until you hit this little button here, this needs compiling button. Hitting this button for the first time will prompt you to save your vmodel file. Save it where you want in the content folder, keeping in mind that wherever you save it will be where it will be compiled within the game folder. And there you go, the model's in Source 2. Now, it's only showing up as a wireframe right now because it doesn't have any materials assigned. Before we dive into the can of worms that is actually creating the material, let's give it a flat color just so we can see it. Right now, the model doesn't have any material groups. Models need a default material group first before any materials can be assigned. So let's hit the Add button, search for Material, and select Default Material Group. Now that we have a default material group, we can actually assign it a material. I like using the error model material simply because it's a flat color, it's not too bright, it stands out, it's useful for getting the general geometry of the model. So let's select this magnifying glass, search for error, double click to select it, hit the needs compiling button, and there we go. The model's in. You can change the scene here to see how it looks like under different environments. Like I like using the sunset one because it's nice and warm colors. You can select it to use an HDRI. These are ones that Valve used. And if you wanted to, you can even open it up in Source Filmmaker right now. You can open it up in Source Filmmaker, create a new session, add your model, zoom in, add a light, and there we have it. Just real quick, let me do that again, but with the Bantusi Exchange ship. So under Model Dock, I'm going to create a new session. Let's change this back to the default lighting mode, add meshes, get back out and go to where I saved the Bantusi Exchange ship meshes, select all of them. If your model has multiple meshes, select all of them at the same time, hit open, hit compile. I'm going to save it under here for Bantusi Exchange. And then I'm going to add a material group, a default material group, and I'm going to give it the error model material, hit compile again, and there we go, same thing. The model's in, and now we can work on creating the materials that we're going to assign to these models. Now, material setup is probably going to be the thing that takes the most amount of time. Whether you're working from a Source 1 model or a model from another game, the biggest difficulty will be properly configuring the various textures you have to work within Source 2's PBR material pipeline. The key thing will be to identify what each texture you have corresponds to within this pipeline. For the Source 1 model, Source 1 compiles its image textures into VTF texture files, so let's grab these 3 texture files and copy them over to a location within your add-on folder. I'm going to do this very similar structure to what I had it as in Source 1. Now that we've copied these textures over, what we need to do is turn them into an image file format that the Source 2 engine can read. Source 2 is not natively compatible with the old VTF Valve texture format. It is, however, compatible with a whole bunch of regular image texture formats, such as JPEG files, PNG, TGA, EXR, MKS, TIFF files, PFM, and even Photoshop files. So if you're making a texture in Photoshop, Source 2 can use it directly without you having to save it as some other format first. In order to do this with VTF files, we need VTF Edit. So open up each one with VTF Edit, go to File, Export, and then save it, and it will export as a TGA, and do that for all your files. For cleanliness sake, I'm going to delete the original VTF files. You don't have to do that, I just like to get rid of them because they're annoying and they're in the way. With these textures now in TGA format, you're technically ready to go, but it's important that you first understand what is in each file before you continue. When setting up materials in Source 2, you can't tell the editor to look at a specific color or alpha channel within a given image texture. So if any of these textures have an alpha channel with data in it, we will need to pull that data out as a separate file. Here, if I open my base color texture, we can see that the alpha channel has the self-illumination lights in it. So I'm going to pull that out as a separate file. Additionally, my normal has an ambient occlusion texture in its alpha channel. I think that's what it is, at least. And so I'm going to do the exact same thing here. Now that we have all the texture files pulled out, let's go back into the editor tools, go back into material editor, hit new to create a new material, and we can't see anything immediately. That's because we first need to save it as a material file. So hit save, and save it somewhere that makes sense, keeping in mind that wherever you save it is going to be where it's compiled to within the game folder, and give it a name that makes sense as well. I'm going to give it hgn_core, and the reason why I'm giving it that name is that is also the name that the model is specifically looking for. So I'm going to save it. You can see the preview. You don't need to save it as what the model is looking for. You can save it as anything you like because we'll be assigning materials later on. Now we're able to see the preview sphere, and we're able to change the material properties. Let me just make this larger for a little bit. This process can get quite complex. If you click up here on the shader button, you can see all the different shaders that are available. Certain rendering features are only available in certain shaders. For example, if you're reporting a model that has skin, you might want to use the skin shader because that enables subsurface scattering. For most cases, the VR Simple model is going to work just fine. However, in this case, because the model that I'm porting has self-illumination lights on it, I want to select VR Complex. And you can see a few more things open up right down here. You can also see that the ambient occlusion texture loaded automatically. For each texture type, the editor is looking for an image file that has the same name as the material that you're editing, in this case hgn_core, and then a specific suffix. For example, for color textures, it's looking for _color before the file extension. Normal is looking for _normal, and in ambient occlusion, it's looking for _AO, which is why it automatically picked it up. It saw that the image file name is the same as the name as the material, it's located in the same location, and it has this suffix at the end, and therefore it automatically loaded it. The file suffix is important to keep in mind because by default, the editor is looking for files that have that suffix when you're looking to assign a specific type of texture. For example, if I click on the folder icon to go search for a color texture, and I go to the folder where I saved all my textures, I can see that nothing is present. If I were to go back into Windows Explorer and change the name of the file to have _color at the end, it would show up here right away. However, you don't need to do that. And under this little drop down here, you can just select all images and then select whichever one you want. So in this case, I'm going to select my color texture, hit open, and you can see that the preview sphere updated automatically. If you want to see the material previewed on the model itself, hit this little stick dude down here, hit the little magnifying glass and search for the model, HGN, double click, and you can see that now we're previewing this material on the model that we're porting. Now it's just a matter of going through and assigning each of your image textures to their appropriate slot here within the material properties. If you don't have a texture that fits one of these, that's okay. Just do your best to assign each image texture into their appropriate slot. If you don't know what you're looking for each one, I recommend Googling examples because that can give you a sense of what each particular type of texture file or image map looks like. So for this, I'm going to put the normal into the normal slot. I don't have a roughness map, I don't think at least, so I'm going to keep moving on. Now, I have a metalness texture, but right now it's not letting me assign one. It just gives me a little slider, and that's because the metalness texture has not been enabled. So under this properties on the left here, I'm going to enable specular, I'm going to enable a metalness texture, wait for it to think for a bit, and then I'm going to click on the folder, click on all images, and select my metalness texture, and wait for it to think some more. And now we can see the metallic reflectivity of this material show up right here on the model. Similarly, I also have a self-illumination texture, but it's not showing up here. So take the box here, click on the folder, search for it, open it, and now if we look around on this model, we can see that the lights are now glowing. Shaders are complex, and there's a huge number of things that you can do to customize it. I recommend you have some fun and play around with the different options just to see what they do and start seeing how you might be able to create some really complex and interesting models. In the meantime, however, this material is done, so let's hit save. It'll take a little second for it to think. And when it's done thinking, let's go back into the model doc editor here, and under default material group, hit the magnifying glass again, HGN, to find the material that we created, select it, hit accept, hit recompile, and there we have it. Our model has been compiled, and material has been assigned, and it's ready for use in Source 2 Filmmaker. Now let's do this again for the Bentusi Exchange. The Bentusi Exchange ship model came directly from the game, so in this case I'm going to be using the image textures that also came directly from the game. In this case they all came in DDS file format, so I already have them selected here. I'm going to copy them, move back over to the content folder, find a location to throw them in, which is the Ben folder that I already have set up, throw them in here. Now I'm going to do the exact same thing as I did with the VTF textures. I'm going to convert each one to a file format that Source 2 can open. I'm going to split each texture out so that there's only one texture file per type of texture. And this time I'm going to save each one with the appropriate file suffix so that the engine can pick it up automatically. Since this model has two materials, I'm going to do this all again with the second set of image textures. Just as before, I'm going to delete these old files because I don't want them cluttering up anymore, even though they absolutely do not have to be deleted at all. And now let's go back into the material editor and do everything we did before again. So material editor, new material, save it in a location that makes sense, give it a name, Bentusi Exchange, spelling is hard, hit save. I'm going to right away preview it on the model that I want. Shader, VR complex, enable specular, metalness, self-illumination. Now, because these texture files are quite large, it can hang and slow down quite a bit when it's actually doing the compiling of each of these textures. So after I select each one, it's going to hang for a little bit. Then I open the normal. No roughness, so I'll move on. Select the metal. Select the AO. Select the self-illumination. And we're good to go. Save the material and wait for it to finish saving again. And then since this model has two different materials, I just have to do all that again with the second set of image textures. Just as before, hit save, wait for it to finish thinking. And now that we've created our materials, just go back to the model block editor and assign each of the materials that we created. Hit compile, and there we go. model's ready to go. We can now use this model in Source Filmmaker or Hammer. In fact, if we go back to Source Filmmaker here, we can see that without us doing anything, this material updated automatically, and if I were to look for the Bentusi model, Bentusi, we can see it shows up right here. Now, of course, it's a huge model, so the lights don't exactly light it up particularly well, but it is nevertheless here in Source Filmmaker. And that's how you port models. So have fun porting models into Source Filmmaker. Take care out there.